عشان أرسمت again. أرسمت again. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce myself. I'm Konstantin Topuri, Rector of the University of Georgia, and let me welcome participants of today's conference. And it's a great honor to be before you today and to address to our conference the most pressing and significant challenges of our time. This conference is organized by the University of Georgia Security Platform think tank. As we gather today, we are reminded of the profound impact that conflicts and wars have on societies and nations. The aftermath of the war in Ukraine will have lasting impression on both Europe and South Caucasus, touching the lives of countless individuals and shaping the geopolitical landscape of the region. It is in this context that we have come together to explore the prospects and implications that arise from this transformative period. This conference serves as a platform for scholars, policymakers, and experts from various fields to engage in thoughtful discussion, exchange ideas, and contribute to a deeper understanding of the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. Our aim is not only to analyze the past and present, but also envision a better future. Throughout the conference, we'll delve into a range of topics, including post-war reconstruction, regional security, economic development, political stability, and the role of the international actors. We'll hear from esteemed speakers who have dedicated their lives to studying, researching, and working in these areas. The expertise will undoubtedly shed light on the complexities of the situation and help us chart a path towards a sustainable peace. Looking ahead, there are many challenges and opportunities facing Europe and South Caucasus. This includes issues related to energy security, economic development, and political stability. It will be essential to work together to find innovative solutions to these challenges and to build stronger, more resilient communities that are able to withstand future crises. The war in Ukraine is a sober reminder of the importance of peace, and the road to peace may be challenging, but it's not impossible. By engaging in open and respectful dialogue, we can pave the way for lasting peace and stability in Ukraine. To all the participants, I encourage you to engage actively in the discussion, share your insights, and challenge conventional wisdom. Your contributions are vital in shaping the outcome of the conference and, more importantly, in shaping the future. I'd like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to all the organizers, speakers, panelists who have worked tirelessly to bring this conference to happen. In closing, I will invite you all to embrace the spirit of openness, collaboration, and empathy as we embark on this journey together. Let us seize the moments to not only analyze the past and present, but also to forge a future characterized by peace, understanding, and prosperity. Together we can make the difference. Thank you. I wish you a nice conference and nice stay in Georgia. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. Just let me welcome you and pass the word to our distinguished guest, former Foreign Minister of the Ukraine and CEO of the Center for Russian Studies, Volodymyr Ogrysko.
So I will be focusing on some specific issues which, to my mind, are important to understand. But probably I will start with the name of our conference, After the War in Ukraine. The question is, which war? And who is responsible for this war? Probably it would be better to say a little bit more precise. after the Russian aggression against Ukraine. I do hope that among the participants of our discussion, there is no one who has doubts on the subject. I would only remind you on the UN General Assembly Resolution 3314, adopted in 1974, entitled Definition of Aggression. It seems to me that Russians decided to demonstrate how aggression looks like, because Russian actions in Ukraine fully fall under all, I would like to repeat, all characteristics of aggression. If someone has doubts, please open the text and compare with what is going on today in my country. So the simple question arises: how the international law qualifies aggression? And the answer is absolutely clear and simple. This is a crime. So Russia committed crime of aggression. And then next question: what does it mean in practical terms? It means that Russian political and military leadership must be punished for that. That is why the establishment of international tribunal is badly needed. If I'm not mistaken, there are already 32 countries who will participate. And I do hope that countries who have been attacked by Russia before and which territories are till now under Russian occupation should and will join this tribunal, simply to be on the right side of history. The same is valid also, dear friends, for Russian war criminals. They will be punished according and by the International Criminal Court. I will give you only one fact to understand the scale of our horror. According to the Ukrainian Prosecutor General, Russians committed more than 60,000, I will repeat, 60,000 crimes within first 12 months of aggression. Now we have already 15 months of this aggression. They killed civilians, they tortured elder people, they raped women, they captured kids. So the first implication for Russia, at least for Russia, will be national and international punishment for her crimes. In my view, it will be also a very understandable signal worldwide. Every crime will be not forgotten. Every crime will be punished. Let us not forget that Russia will also pay contributions for the damage caused by her aggression. Very preliminary calculations say that there are more than 750 100 billion of US dollars. Of course, this is not the final figure, and losses may increase up to 1 trillion US dollars. Not saying about recent horrific crime when Russians destroyed Kakhovka Dam. So the next implication will be the Russian economic disaster. And the next signal to the world will be also very clear. The price of aggression is very high. But in my view, much higher will be the political price. I see, I'm dealing with Russia already many years. I see two options after the Russian military defeat in Ukraine. Option number one, Putin's regime will be over. Option number two, Russia will cease to exist. First option gives Russia some chances for the future changes. But due to the Russian imperialistic mentality, I don't believe in it. Even now, this smart part of the Russian society, also it is very small. is defending the aggression and calls for the continuation of war. So-called good Russians, хорошие русские, are in fact old imperialists. They see new beautiful Russia, прекрасная Россия будущего, only as a new empire. In fact, they wait now when Ukrainians, with their blood, eliminate Putin's regime, and after that they come to power. Frankly speaking, we in Ukraine do understand what kind of new Russian regime comes, simply because one of the leaders of the so-called Russian opposition said recently that he sees some elements of Nazism in Ukraine now. You can imagine what they will say after that. Second option will cause tectonic changes in the world politics. I am talking about the disintegration of Russia. Because global totalitarianism will be weakened, and it opens new, really bright possibilities for the world democratic order. And what is, in my view, very important, no one in the West should fear this kind of developments, because, first of all, it will remove major nuclear threat worldwide. And in my view, it will be not the end, but the beginning of history. The only precondition for that is strong anti-Russian coalition. It is no place for neutrality now. In fact, it is indirect support for aggressor. Appeals for peace negotiations to freeze the current situation are cynic and simply stupid, because they will not stop the war. On the contrary, they will give aggressor only new chances and new possibilities. But in any case, I would like you to know Ukraine will fight until we restore our national integrity. And I am pretty sure we will succeed. The main prerequisite, as to my mind, for lasting peace in Europe, in South Caucasus, is Russia's military defeat and Ukraine's and Georgia's full membership in NATO. Why it is so important? Because it should be no gray zones in Europe anymore. Russia sees them as an invitation to commit new crimes. And we must finally stop this nonsense. I do hope that forthcoming NATO summit in Vilnius will not repeat the tragic mistake of Bucharest summit of 2008. I do hope that Chancellor Scholz will not repeat the mistake of Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy, and that President Biden will be as brave as President George Bush Jr., who fully support Ukraine's and Georgia's full membership in NATO at that time. But in the meantime, we should be defended by security guarantees like Finland and Sweden on their path to NATO. This is will happen after our victory over the Russian aggressor. But we have to have a clear timetable for joining NATO. Otherwise, everything will return to the point where we are now. Russia, if it does not disintegrate after the war, after some time, will again and again turn into aggressive beast. Unfortunately, this is her nature. But I am optimist, because God and truth are on our side. I thank you.
We are entering now a panel session. Let me remind you that the first panel is an introductory panel. It deals with the military outcome, military predictions, and analysis of the plausible outcomes of the military solution and what the effects, economic and political effects, we might face after the military solution of this aggressive war. I fully agree with Volodymyr. Nobody doubts that this is clear Russian aggression against sovereign Ukrainian nation. Don't forget also, after the panel one, to go to your respective working group because only after your work in the respective working group you will be rewarded by a lunch. And then we will have a final session 3, where we will conclude all the brilliant ideas, solutions, possible solutions, and then perhaps come up with a strategic path towards a stable peace. So, without further ado, let me invite our good friend, Ina Dubinsky, from the U.S. Agency of Global Media, and I will not intervene into the area of responsibility of presenting your panel members. They're all brilliant, and all the panel members, I will welcome you here, and please take your seats here on the panel first. Thank you.
So mic is hot, right? Mic is hot? Okay, wonderful. All right. Good morning, everybody. My name is Ina Dubinsky. I'm Development and Training Manager at the U.S. Agency for Global Media, the U.S. Government International Broadcasting Organization, comprised of the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, that is known in Georgia as Radio Tavi Supleva, also Middle Eastern Broadcasting Network, Radio Free Asia, and Radio TV Marti, broadcasting to Cuba. So today I would like to express my gratitude to the University of Georgia for hosting this wonderful event. And also, as you know, the first panel discussion will focus on the options of military outcome and respective politico-economic consequences of the Russian war in Ukraine. Currently, an area roughly the size of Bulgaria is occupied in Ukraine by Russia. So this conversation is on the record. At the end of discussion, we'll give an opportunity for our esteemed audience to ask questions of our panelists. And now let me introduce our highly esteemed panelists. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Margarita Asenova, Senior Fellow at the Jamestown Foundation, Dr. Thornike Gardadze, Professor at Paris Institute of Political Studies and Associate Fellow at Jacques Delors Foundation, Andrei Kolesnikov, to my right, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and online, hello, we have Dr. Evgenia Gaber, non-resident Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council in Turkey, and at the Center in Modern Turkish Studies, Carleton University. Hello, Evgenia. So I would like to ask our highly esteemed speakers to make a 2-minute assessment of military, political, and economic aspects of the Russian full-scale war in Ukraine, which Russia holds in violation of the core principles of the UN Charter, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence. So after your 2-minute comments, the discussion will focus on how you see the end of Russian war in Ukraine and what would be the major plausible outcomes and implications of the regional and international dimensions. So, Margarita Asenova, women first, right? So what is the trajectory in your mind of the Russian war in Ukraine?
I think we are beginning to see the major counteroffensive by the Ukrainian forces in the east of the country. This is the beginning, and it's probably going to grow much larger. We don't know where exactly and how this is going to go, but it is going to be certainly big. And two things can be observed at this point in terms of military developments. The corruption of the Russian army that is visible, and the corruption of the spirit of Russian soldiers as well. And the contrast here is with Ukrainian army, which managed to build very strong capacity in the last 2 years. Actually, they started since the invasion of the Donbass and annexation of Crimea, with the training provided by the United States, United Kingdom, and Canada. Now with the supply of weapons to the Ukrainian army. So the military capacities are growing, but also the spirit is not broken, the opposite. It's growing stronger. The determination of the Ukrainian people, the army, and the society is absolutely incredible. And I think that the contrast of these two developments within the Russian army and within the Ukrainian army and society is going to determine the outcome of the war. It doesn't mean that there won't be more civilian victims, as we saw with the flooding of the blowing up of the dam. But I think the trajectory is positive for Ukraine, and I do expect that Russian forces are going to be kicked out of the entire territory of Ukraine, including Crimea, and I believe this is going to happen sooner than most of us expect.
Dr. Gerdadze, so what is your assessment of the military, political, and economic aspects, current aspects of the war in Ukraine?
I fully share what Margarita said about the developments. I would not repeat what was said already. That's a few more aspects very quickly in 2 minutes. First, that there is no and there will be no Russian victory. What was Russia's objective? It was described in Putin's long paper published in July 2021 about no Ukraine, no Ukrainian nation, no Ukrainian statehood, etc. This is a failure. One. Second, we don't know yet what will be the extent of Ukrainian victory. And it's very important to have a full-fledged Ukrainian victory. And what is Ukrainian victory is the liberation of Ukrainian territory within the internationally recognized borders of 1991. And this should be the objective of the whole civilized world, the West, and also all Russia's neighbors. Third, what the Russians want now is to freeze the conflict. They don't want negotiations for peace, but they want to freeze the conflict because they think that in the long run, if the conflict is frozen, the West, there will be Ukraine fatigue in the West. Maybe in 2024 elections in the US, there will be a more pro-Russian administration, and they want to freeze the conflict. One or two more aspects. Ukrainians and Biden administration want quick success now within this counteroffensive. And this is very important for the Americans to justify more help to Ukraine, and it's very important for the Ukrainians to show that the Western aid was used in a very efficient way. Last point, or maybe the last 2 points. First is that there will be NATO enlargement at the end of this war. I don't think it will be before the end of this war. And people like, even people like Henry Kissinger or the French President Macron, who were extremely cautious about NATO enlargement and critical of Ukraine NATO membership, now they say that Ukraine has to become and will become NATO member. And it will change the security architecture in Europe. And the last point is more global view on the level of the world. This war is a European war, but it's a globalized war. It has global implications. And we see non-European actors becoming more and more active. China in this Ukraine war. China, India, Brazil somehow. We also saw Vatican and South African, some other global South representatives to be involved to try to negotiate. And I think that after the war, these tendencies will continue. So it will change the global architecture within the Europe, but the tendencies that appeared today and even a little bit before on the world level will continue.
Thank you, Professor. You basically set the outlook for our discussion, and indeed, Kissinger, by his 100th anniversary, changed his mind about Ukraine's membership in NATO. Dr. Gaber, so your thoughts?
With attacks on energy infrastructure, on the port infrastructure, which was supposed to be under the protection of the so-called Green Deal, attacks on major facilities which provided lines of communication for Ukrainian people, and now this ended up with, at least so far, with the explosion of the Kakhovka gas. So that's basically what we are now seeing as a major escalation so far, because this can be seen as the first attempt to use the weapons of mass destruction, because the flood that followed and the major damage that was caused to the civilian population of Ukraine, and also we can actually determine this as ecocide in the whole Black Sea region, because major areas have felt the implications of this disaster, man-made catastrophe actually. That's the scope of the atrocities and of the indiscriminate assault. I want to underline that. It's not only about the military aggression, but also cultural genocide, ecocide, and deportation of Ukrainian children, and raping of Ukrainian women, and all atrocities and war crime that happen in the occupied territories. So this is one thing regarding the assessment of what is going on in Ukraine. It's not only about the battlefield itself. The second point, and I totally agree here with the Professor Tornike, who said that Russia will try to freeze the territorial gains it now has in Ukraine, because after this, I think this is a general assessment and general expectation that the counter-offensive or counter-offensives of Ukraine, because this might not be only one, but a series of counter-offensives will lead to Russia losing major parts of the territories in Ukraine. So now what we see is these attempts to call to negotiations from global feminist movements, peace-making efforts, facilitation, mediation, up to this desire to intimidate and to put pressure on the Western partners of Ukraine in order to stop supplies of Western weapons and arms to Ukraine. On the Ukrainian side, my last point here, there is only one expectation, that this war will end with the full victory of Ukraine. And as Rector mentioned in his welcoming remarks, the expectation is that we will have a lasting peace and stability. And for that, we need liberation of Ukrainian territories of 1991 and Ukraine's joining NATO. Other than that, any other scenario, protracted conflict, frozen conflict, negotiated, premature negotiated peace will just lead to the same scenario, meaning that empire strikes back, Russia will reconstitute its forces, and it will attack again. So I'll stop here.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Gaber. And now, Andrei Kolesnikov. So what is your assessment of the status of the war?
Let me concentrate on the domestic dimension of this problem, because Russia will not disappear from the map. geographical map, social map, political map, and it's important to understand what is happening. Given the fact that we have only 2 minutes, I can begin from old Italian anecdote, not historical anecdote, but anecdote as such, from Mussolinian time. During the breakfast with Mussolini, one of his sons asks him, "Daddy, what kind of regime you have constructed?" And being furious, Mussolini answered, "Eat up and shut up." And this is kind of a social contract which has been suggested from the state side to the society before this war. And people didn't intervene into problems of the state. State did not intervene into private life of the majority of the population, but it was kind of an authoritarian contract. Right now we have another kind of contract, unfortunately, because since the period of so-called partial mobilization, Putin asked people to share responsibility for this war. He asked them for their corpses, for their physical involvement in this process, and this is something new. And this is kind of a more or less dangerous for this regime, because paradoxically Russian society is a modernized society, and people don't want to be involved physically in this war in trenches. But nevertheless, the answer of the society was kind of a adaptation to this, not protest, but adaptation. We are talking about majority, which is following the steps of the state. But at the same time, I can say that Russians do not resist. This is a mythology that all Russians are supporting this disaster. Other side of mythology is that not all Russians are supporting this disaster. The truth is somewhere in the middle. So, but my final point here is that we must understand that Putin constructed not simply authoritarian state, but right now I can name it hybrid totalitarian state. And we must understand the scale of pressure on society and primarily civil society of Russia.
Thank you, Andrei. You know, Russians also now joke that Moscow will be ready to talk to Kiev as soon as Ukrainian army withdraws from Ukrainian territory, right? So now let's go to the main discussion. Again, I remind everybody that at the end you will be able to ask questions. But my first question is for Dr. Gardadze. What are the possible military and political outcomes of Russia's war in Ukraine, and how likely are they to happen?
First, I'm not a military expert, even if I talk a lot with people who are more knowledgeable. As someone mentioned just a few minutes ago, there probably will be several counteroffensives, because it is at this point it's quite difficult to imagine that one counteroffensive will be enough to. This is not impossible, I guess, but it will be more complicated to obtain a total victory in only one offensive. But this offensive that will take place or already has started, because we shouldn't wait for an announcement of a D-Day. This is not the way the Ukrainians behave, and we remember that the previous counteroffensive was announced in Kherson region, then it took place in Kharkov region several weeks later, and then it came back to Kherson region. So it's a very clever tactics from the Ukrainian military to mislead the enemy and also to improvise somehow during the counteroffensive. So it's very difficult to assess what will be the extent of Ukrainian victory. What is important is to see the level of disorganization inside the Russian army, or those people who compose the Russian armed forces. They are increasingly high level of tensions inside. We see Prigozhin becoming at least partially, he is escaping the control, at least from the Russian army and the legal forces. We see also some behaviors from the Chechen component of the Russian armed forces, and this is the internal tensions within the Russian elites between the FSB and the armed forces and the political leadership of the country. So this gives us hope that there will be no Russian victory. But what will be the extent of the defeat? It's very difficult to predict. So I will stay more like there will be a certain victory from the Ukrainian side in this counteroffensive. This victory should be important enough to permit other counteroffensives and not the discussions, especially from the Western side. Oh, now you showed that you are not able to win the war, now let's start negotiations. So this should be avoided at any price.
You mentioned Prigozhin, who is also the czar of propaganda war in Ukraine, and not only in Ukraine, all around the world. So as a media representative, I can't help asking our esteemed panelists about the counter offensive on this propaganda. So how successful is the West in countering that? And also, which comes together, I think, what is the influence of the PR, President Zelensky PR skills, how they affect the coverage of the war? Maybe, Margarita, if you could, please.
Let me first jump in with a couple of comments on the prospect and what needs to happen and what will happen after the war in Ukraine, because they are two different things, but they're connected. What must happen and what the West should not allow to have any other outcome is full liberation of the territories of Ukraine, war crime tribunal to try all the responsible persons for committed over 60,000 war crimes, and payment of reparations to Ukraine by Russia. These three things must happen. Before they happen, nobody should be talking about lifting any sanctions against Russia. These three conditions must be fulfilled. And we're talking often about potential negotiations, peace negotiations, partition of Ukraine, giving some territory to Russia. This is not serious talk. There are articles, there are some groups, some think tanks publishing about it. Any serious politician knows what happened. This is a war in the heart of Europe that hasn't happened for 70 years. It challenged everything we believe in. It challenged the life Europe lived since World War II. It brought horror and not only destruction to Ukraine, but horror for so many Europeans who are next door and witnessing what is happening in Ukraine. And if anyone is thinking of a compromise with Russia or another appeasement of Putin, there is the Eastern European states here that are not going to allow this to happen. We have Poland, we have the Baltics, we have Slovakia, we have Romania. These states are growing, they're rising on the horizon, they're rising as European powers. This war is making them European powers. They took the brunt of the support for Ukraine and providing any kind of assistance they could. And this is not going to go unnoticed and not affect European politics. They're members of NATO, they're members of the European Union, and those decisions in the future are not going to be taken without the very serious participation, input, and consent by those countries. And those countries, especially Poland, is not going to put up with any kind of appeasement and compromise for Russia. What will happen after the war, I think there is going to be for sure a rupture in Russia. Either this is going to be a civil war with so many private armies. Apparently there are over 40 private armies now that are built in Russia, not only Wagner and Gazprom, but others. That power struggle is going to lead to a civil war led mostly by those private armies. State collapse, Russia is a failed state, and we need to remember this. It was a failed state before the war began. It failed to develop into a nation state, into a civil state, or into a stable imperial state even. It did fail economically. It became a rent economy for decades. The social structure is breaking down. The social payments are suffering. There were so many protests since 2019. We remember a wave of social protests in Russia showing what the state of the society is. The demographics are abysmal, and the war made them even worse. So the disintegration of Russia is something that needs to be looked at and considered, and scenarios must be developed to protect the countries along the borders with Russia as soon as possible by those countries that, like Georgia and other Caucasus states in Central Asia, are right there on the border with Russia, and by Western powers that have the potential and have the ability to influence outcomes. So this is on that front. On the front of media and the PR of the coverage of the Western media actually provides pretty decent coverage of the war. Sometimes they focus much more on human stories and the human cost of the war, which is terrific, which is horrendous, and that brings the publics to support the war. We're talking about American administration, whether if there is a Republican administration, support for Ukraine will continue. I have to tell you that many Republicans in Congress are even stronger supporters of Ukraine than many Democrats. They wanted faster assistance, they wanted more assistance, especially those traditional Republicans who are not going to back down. I think Ukraine has bipartisan support in American Congress, and that is going to stay that way regardless whether the administration is going to be Republican or Democrat. Secondly, the public is very supportive of Ukraine. 70% or more in the United States support Ukraine and consider that assistance needs to continue. And this is as a result of media coverage as well. I think some politicians are not covering the war or not reacting to the war the way they should, especially last year. I should mention here Macron, I should mention the hesitation of the German chancellor. I should mention some politicians that were more hesitant. Now they joined, they saw where the tide is going. But the Western media in general has provided pretty good coverage. On the other hand, I think that the West and the Western media is not doing as good of a job countering disinformation about the war as Ukrainians are doing themselves. With all these incredible videos that they're publishing, all this public campaign that is run by civil journalists mostly, and the army itself, and the president is a great communicator by profession. I think they're setting up a lesson for the world, how we deal with a disastrous situation, with such a difficult situation, while you're preserving your sanity and also your sense of humor, which is quite unbelievable. There is a Rand Corporation study that just came out. Lessons from Ukrainian army communication and information strategy during the war for the American army in the future. And that tells you a lot. Just the title of the study tells you a lot about how successful the Ukrainian information campaign has been.
Thank you, Margarita. Indeed, to follow up on what you just said, earlier this week, the U.S. Department of State sanctioned 7 leading members of the Russian intelligence-linked group, right? And one entity for their role in Russia's malign influence campaigns and destabilization operations that have been targeting the EU, Moldova, the United Kingdom, the United States, right? Basically the Balkans, the whole world. Now in Africa, they are very active. So have the democratic community been successful in combating these operations, aiming to weaken support for democratic governments and principles? Dr. Thornket, so you wanted to say something about, okay, and then I will address this question to Dr. Gaber, maybe to think about it while you, Thornike, follow up on what Margarita has said. Yes, please.
On this PR issue, yeah, I fully agree that in the West, the Ukrainian cause won the most of mainstream media, but the West is characterized with pluralism in media. There's still some pro-Russian, quite active media groups or personalities who use every possible device and every possible media resource. But in the West, yeah, it's very clear. Ukraine has support, majority of politicians, even those who were pro-Russian before, like Marine Le Pen in France. Now she's quite reluctant to admit that she was supporting Putin. But what happens outside Europe? Again, here the situation is much more complicated. I'm traveling, I'm meeting people from Africa, from Middle East, and in this part of the world, this voice is heard as a Europeanocentrist, and they are much more critical. They are very much receptive of Russian narrative. In Africa, the Russia Today is now one of the most popular media in Francophone Africa. I mean, in Mali, Central African Republic, so they all watch Russia Today in French.
Actually, the numbers of research show that hardly 5% of population tune into them.
Yeah, but still,
that's the recent research.
But the opinion when you talk to, I don't know, the academics or students from these countries, including the from Middle East and North Africa, the image is much less in favor of Ukraine, unfortunately. And this is one of the things that we should keep on mind. And that's why now the Zelensky himself and Minister Kuleba now are developing these links with what we call Global South. And he traveled in Saudi Arabia, he met Indian Prime Minister, Kuleba did a tour in Africa. This is becoming also very important. I just wanted to add these comments shortly.
Much, Professor Gerdadze.
Offensive in countering disinformation and in information influence operations. We've been on the defensive. We need to finally get on the offensive.
Right.
And there is a smart way to do it. We don't have to repeat what the Russians are doing. Just telling the truth and bombarding the publics with the truth about the billions of Putin, about the Russian society, about the Russian army. This is the best way to counter the propaganda machine of the Russian, what's remaining of the Russian Empire.
Yeah, so let's follow up on that question that I asked Dr. Gaber. So have the democratic community been successful in combating these operations aiming to weaken support for democratic governments and principles? We don't hear you. Hold on.
I think that the main advantage, at the same time, the disadvantage of the democratic institutions and democratic states is that all democratic countries and governments try to play by the rules, which is the right and correct way to do so. But when you have Russia as your counterpart, which has violated all possible rules and has never ever abided by those rules and has never ever played by the rules, it makes things tougher because you are limited with all the procedures, with all the liberal democratic norms and rules and principles, whereas on the other side, you have a country which just do not care about that. So I would say that the democratic governments and generally the West is learning its lessons. And Ukraine has learned its lessons actually since 2014, and this is one of the reasons why we have been so successful in countering Russian disinformation and generally information warfare and hybrid influences now. Of course, President Zelensky is a great communicator himself, so is our Minister of Foreign Affairs, but that's also something that we have paid a high price in learning since 2014, because we've been in the state of war for at least 9 years. It's not something that only started in February 2022. So this is one of the reasons why we have been able also to share our experiences and to exchange our lessons learned with our Western partners. And as Margarita mentioned, the American forces are learning from us. I'm just coming from a couple of visits to European capitals where we shared our experience in national resilience in building capacities inside the country in the information warfare. So in a way, I think that we've been doing much better now than we did in 2014. On the other hand, it's important not to underestimate the level of penetration of Russian agents of influence in the Western societies, and not only in the Western, actually globally. We're talking about political corruption, we're talking about academia, we're talking about think tanks, we're talking about analytical community, about far-right and populist political parties, about huge financial resources that Russia has been investing in supporting those political parties or NGOs, or even sometimes honorary consuls, all these shadow networks of malign influences. So it's huge, and it's not really easy to combat that and to counter that. Anyways, nevertheless, I think that because sense of humor was mentioned, you know, there is a great Twitter account which is called Darth Putin, saying that I remain a master strategist. So in a way, Putin himself has done a great job in showing how shallow Russian propaganda is, and how denying the reality has become a major strategy of the Russian government. So we sometimes even half-jokingly thank the Russian government for doing their strategic communication so badly that it actually helped us to promote our own narratives. Last point here regarding the Global South, and I think it's important, we still have to remember that a great number of countries are still either trying to stick to this kind of neutrality, sitting on the fence, non-alignment movement, or actually trying to benefit from the current situation. And Russia has been great in capitalizing the existing vulnerabilities. That's why this information warfare is not only about promoting Russian narratives, but actually about feeding the existing anti-American, anti-Western narratives, disruption of trust to Western institutions and to legitimate governments. It's also about this resentment in the countries of the Global South, and this feeling of, you know, this phrase which has become common, that every European war becomes global war, but not every global war becomes European. So there is a lot to improve on our side also, because all the lessons from the past, from Iraq and Afghanistan to all genocide in Rwanda or other countries, which have not been addressed properly, and aggression in Georgia in 2008, for example, which was not addressed properly before, that now complicates the situation for Ukraine when we have to address this war of aggression in 2022.
Now, Andrei Kolesnikov, I would like to touch upon another issue. How may the war outcome affect frozen conflict solutions, institutions, and mechanisms, including in Georgia and Moldova, and unresolved Balkans conflicts, where Russia exerts malign influence?
You know, again, I'm a specialist on domestic issues, not on foreign policy, but I can say that Russia has, in these circumstances, foreign policy as such, because right now all the efforts are on military side of this conflict, and yes, Russia could be more or less successful in information war, and above mentioned Global South also appears somewhere in Europe. When you can talk with any owner of the store in Brussels or somewhere else, you can hear some announcement about, let's say, oh, Russia is bad, but at the same time, NATO was NATO's enlargement, and Putin answered simply. You can hear it everywhere, and this is a problem. And information war is continuing until now. So, in that sense, Russia demonstrated astonishing level of resilience, astonishing level of survival in all terms, in economic terms, in information terms, etc., etc. So this angle is also unresolved. I can only say that we must avoid oversimplification of the situation.
Margarita, you've been watching closely the frozen conflict. So what are your thoughts?
The situation right now, the geopolitical situation, does provide opportunities for resolution of frozen conflicts. Just one example, the Armenia-Azerbaijan negotiations that are going on right now. They are much easier now. I mean, there's still very many problems, but nevertheless, they are much more likely to succeed, to have an agreement eventually, simply because Russia is in a much weaker position. And it cannot be the leading force in that because it doesn't have much to provide. It has to withdraw some of the troops Russia had to withdraw some of its troops deployed in other regions, such as South Ossetia, such as the places where they had stationed troops, some from Tajikistan, some from Karabakh as well. So what does that mean? It means that the countries that have suffered from protracted conflicts for a long time have an opportunity to reach out to those regions and talk and negotiate and make arrangements while Russia is in a weaker position. The same in the Balkans. In the Balkans, there is a great opportunity to resolve long-standing issues, and there is a great opportunity to blow them up into a full-scale war, as we see the Serbian army piling troops on the border with Kosovo and so on. And for as long as Vučić has the support of Putin, he's going to be emboldened with these steps. If he doesn't have the support of Russia, if Russia starts collapsing, if Russia starts focusing on domestic affairs because there is no space and time and finances to diplomatically support or informationally influence those countries, things are going to change very quickly. And what I'm going to say here is very important. All these leaders that are still relying on the support of Russia, including parts of the Georgian government, improving relations with Russia when Russia is committing war crimes. The dam on the north is going to break down, and the flood is going to come to all these countries if they are not on the right position right now. They have to gather Western support, not push Western support away, not push Western allies away. They need to talk to their neighbors, not only in the areas affected by protracted conflict, but also, like Georgia, neighbors in the North Caucasus, Ingushetia and Dagestan and Chechnya and Kabardino-Balkaria. These republics, they need, Georgia needs to develop very good relationship with each of them so that a spillover does not happen and affect Georgia. And I don't see this happening. I see relations with Moscow being strengthened on the Georgia part, on Tbilisi part, and on the Balkans, in Serbia part, instead of the opposite. I see these leaders are not seeing further than their noses, and they're not seeing in the future. They don't have the imagination to see what is coming and prepare for it so that their own people don't suffer and so that they politically survive. It should be self-surviving technique, not difficult to understand point of view.
Yes, please.
Words on this protracted conflicts and the perspectives. What was the raison d'être of these conflicts? Was Russian presence through the proxies, okay, since the very beginning. So in Georgia, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, in Moldova, Transnistria were Russian proxies. To a lesser extent in Karabakh, maybe, but still Russia was the fundamental player in these conflicts. So now that Russian influence is diminishing because of the war in Ukraine, and then there are obvious signs for that, the chances of resolving of these conflicts are growing. In the case of Karabakh, we see that other actors are now more and more active. We see the growing role of the United States, and they were They were much less present in the last decade, let's say. They are back. European Union is now proposing a very important venue in Brussels, and President Charles Michel is the very efficient mediator. He's recognized as such by both Armenian and Azerbaijani leadership. Turkey is becoming extremely important, and they are very much present in the region together in tandem, of course, with Azerbaijan. So Russian influence is diminishing. In Transnistria, the local proxy regime, if we see how they reacted to the war in Ukraine. Of course, they supported Russia, but they didn't send people. I mean, there are very few Transnistrians who went to fight on the Russian side. These people are quasi-mafia group that dominates the sheriff group. They are very pragmatic. If they see that Russia is defeated, they will find a way to negotiate with Moldova some kind of autonomy, and with the Europeans also, because their economic interests are in Europe more than with Russia. And now the last but not least, Georgia's frozen conflicts. And here, the situation is very paradoxical, because the Georgian government now proposes the idea that Georgia will solve this problem together with Russia, where the entire world is saying the contrary. And this is a huge mistake, because in the 90s, when Georgia was defeated for the first time in this conflict, Shevardnadze was forced to sign a kind of capitulation agreement with Russia, entering the CIS, authorizing Russian military bases in Georgia, also according the nomination of all power ministries with Russia, hoping that Russia will help Georgia to recover its territorial integrity, but nothing similar happened. So now the idea that Russia will help Georgia to recover its territorial integrity just doesn't make sense, and it's against the common sense. Russia has no interest in resolving these conflicts in Georgia, because Russia is losing leverage if they solve this conflict. So it will not happen, and it's quite misleading and not very understandable why we're now buying this idea. Thank you.
Thank you. And Andrei, you wanted to say?
Short note on the same topic. The initial idea of Putin was to re-establish empire, to strengthen empire, to reconstruct this empire, and it is his dream. But at the end of the day, because of this war, he's losing this empire, and he is a failure in that sense. He has achieved diametrically opposed goals. NATO is at the borders of Russia, and he is losing his attractiveness as a person who can solve problems, resolve conflicts, to be kind of a go-between between different sides of some frozen conflicts. So he's losing everything in that sense. And even when he's trying to strengthen his ties with Central Asian republics, we see that they're ready to cooperate rather with China than with Russia. And being a person who wanted this empire, he's finalizing the process of disruption of the Soviet Union. Because what we are witnessing right now, this is the same disruption of the empire, because December 1991, it wasn't the end point of the disruption of empire, it was the only beginning of it. And right now, Putin even physically destroying the Soviet heritage. I mean, when he's shelling some industrial object in Ukraine, he's shelling his kind of a Soviet heritage. He wanted to reconstruct it, but he's destroying it. So this is his problem, long-term problem, and we are witnessing the process of losing reputation by Putin.
So this is sort of like a major geopolitical influence, right, of Russia, as you said, weakening both politically, economically, and geopolitically, of course. As you know, and this is the question for all of you, as you know, in mid-May, Japan invited Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to attend the G7 summit in Hiroshima, right? Where the issues of China's military buildup and Russia's war in Ukraine took center stage. And in his remarks, European Council President Charles Michel summed up Brussels' position. Given its role in the international community and the side of its economy, China has a special responsibility in the world. It has to play by international rules, he said, and we call on China to press Russia to stop its military aggression. So the question for you is China's no-limit partnership with Russia still worth the cost? Or would it be better to, if it served to dial back its support to Moscow in an effort to resuscitate its relations with European capitals? Who would like to answer this question?
Just that. I think the relationship between China and Russia has changed dramatically since the war began, since the full-scale invasion began in February. China was against. There were articles in the China research publications what a potential support of China, of potential aggression would be, and the answer was absolutely not. This is going to isolate China from Europe. It's going to isolate China in Asia, and it's going to consolidate NATO and the European Union as it happened. So it was not recommended by scholars and political strategists in China for Beijing to support Russia. And I think in practical levels, apart from the rhetoric, that support actually was not there. We know that spare parts for airplanes were denied to be exported from China to Russia. We know that certain steps were made that Russia, Moscow was not happy about it. The major point is that the relationship now is Russia is the vassal, in a vassal position to China, not the other way around. And China is making a claim on Central Asia, pushing Russia completely from Central Asia, regardless of the fact that Central Asia benefits a lot now from trade with Russia, but Russia lost all positions there. So several things happened in the Eurasia region that are affecting China as well. First, the decolonization process deepened in all states of the former Soviet Union, and that process is about to be completed. The sense of national identity, the sense of strong, independent, sovereign states that these nations want to have, deepened, and it's much stronger now. We see unprecedented process of integration in Central Asia that was not present for decades, and it's now happening. The last, not last, but one of the important things is that Europe is now absolutely independent from Russian energy, which puts China in a very different position. China tries to export goods to Europe, and it will continue doing so, but the paths, the roads through Russia are as good as dead. All the investment that China made through the Belt and Road Initiative through Russia are now useless. They have to think about other ways, and here comes Central Asia and the Caucasus with the middle corridor, putting the Caucasus and Central Asia on a map of European interest in a completely different way, for export of energy, for export of goods, for export of uranium, you name it. This is a completely different level of importance of the heartland that we haven't seen in the past 3 decades. And China is going to be a major part of it. It has interest in secure and stable and peaceful Central Asia. Therefore, in a way, China is a protector of peace in Central Asia. In a way, it's a protector from Russia, but also for the role that it plays in the Caucasus is the same. It has interests of peaceful and stable Caucasus so that it can export goods through the Caucasus to Europe. But for the United States, China is, of course, a rival, and it's an existential threat. And there are so many things that on the agenda as a communist state that are detrimental to the world as well. So it's an interesting balance, but in terms of China-Russia relationship, Russia is no longer the security actor in Eurasia. China is going to take that position as well. Russia is in a position of a vassal in that relationship, not the determining and the powerful nuclear state that was dictating the conditions for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, for the security arrangement in the region, and so on.
Margarita, you mentioned an interesting point that EU now declared independence from Russia, from Russian energy resources, right? Like gas prices are down. However, Ukraine still transits, Russian oil through its territory, right? And it is not secret that Georgia and other post-Soviet states heavily depend on trade with Russia, right? In many, like gas in Georgia is, use of Russian gas in Georgia is up compared to, a few, like 2010, right? So is there a way to decouple from Russia for the region? I would like to ask this question of Professor Gadan.
Okay, so there are many questions in one question. Maybe to end the question on China. In short term, China is taking huge benefit from this conflict. First, they see that Russia is attacking the West, and it's not China doing that. And so it's good to see that Russia is teasing the West in this conflict. On the other side, as Margarita has pointed out rightly, Russia is becoming more and more dependent on China and becoming junior partner of China. And the Chinese president, when he visits Russia, he gives lessons. And he behaves like almost like a lord, and can provide some advices. The Russians would never accept this kind of advices coming from the Americans or from the Europeans, but they have to support the Chinese giving them the lessons. But in the long term, yeah, China doesn't want this conflict to stand forever. They want maybe weaken Russia, but not Russia disappearing. For them, Russia is a buffer zone now with the West. And they don't want this conflict to continue forever, because China is a country that China's economy relies on exportations. And China doesn't want a real conflict with the West, because losing markets is as difficult as losing the goods providers. So it's in the long term they will act to negotiate and to finish this conflict, but taking more and more benefits from this and making out of Russia their vassal. Now to the question you asked about possible decoupling. Yeah, it's very difficult to decouple, but when it comes to Georgia, Georgia's dependence on Russia raised in the recent years. Georgia has huge problems with Russia starting from 2006 in terms of economic links. Okay, Russia introduced lots of coercive measures, economic measures like embargoes on Georgian agricultural exportations, wines, mineral waters, etc. And we also witnessed the forced deportation of Georgian citizens from Russia in 2006, and the economic dependence of Georgia on Russia has been reduced from compared to 2002. In 2010, 2012, this dependence was not that big, and it was painful for Georgia at the beginning, but Georgia found other markets, and Georgia understood that economic links with Russia are never decoupled with political, geopolitical aspects. When it comes to Russia, Russia always weaponizes not only economy, but culture, sports, everything. So it's very naive, if not more than that, to again making the country dependent on Russian markets. And this was the conscious policy of this government in Georgia, starting from 2012. The Georgian-Russian economic relations became more and more important. At the beginning, West was applauding that. Don't forget that West was quite happy, saying, "Oh, you will find Georgia is doing well, appeasing Russia, and it will lead to a normalization with Russia." It was a mistake, okay, also from the West side. And now, since the war started in Ukraine, these figures are just exploding. And at the short run, it can have some positive impact on Georgian economy. We see the economic growth in Georgia, which is real, but this is very dangerous. It makes Georgia totally dependent economically and later on politically, because the argument is that now that, oh, we depend on Russia so much economically, so we need also political relations to improve with Russia. And this is very, very dangerous. Georgia has signed deepened a comprehensive free trade agreement with Europe. But the figures of trade of Georgia with Europe didn't grow. It remained the same. But the Russia's share augmented very, very significantly.
Right. So let's go to another segment of our discussion. And that's the question for all of you, including Dr. Gaber online. Who will be, in your mind, the biggest geopolitical winners regarding of shifts and the outcome of war in Ukraine? What factors will define that? And are energy transition and renewables big factors? So who would like to answer this question? Who will be the biggest geopolitical winners, regardless of the outcome of the war?
There are never winners when you have a war. They're never winners because the damage is, yes, the destruction is so devastating for people, for generations, not only for Ukrainian people. People in the neighboring countries are also traumatized by the war. And many of them are fighting, so many Georgians are fighting in this war. 46, we talked last night, 46 have already died in the war in Ukraine. They are also Polish soldiers. They are also soldiers from other countries, American soldiers as well, who are volunteering for Ukraine. In that way, yes, there are countries that may benefit from the war. And I cannot for sure say who is benefiting and how. For sure, Russia is losing. The energy exports to Europe are very, very small. They are limited to only 4 countries in Eastern Europe who are exempt from the oil embargo, and this is Hungary, Slovakia, Bulgaria. Bulgaria through sea, and the other countries through the pipeline through Ukraine. Quantities of gas and oil that are transited to Europe are so small right now that they have dropped to insignificant levels. Only about 17 BCM is actually less than that, but the capacity of the Balkan pipeline is 17 BCM, so that's all that could come to European Union that consumes over 450 BCM of gas. You can imagine how small really the share of Russian gas is. The Balkans are still dependent to a large extent, Serbia and also Hungary on Russian gas. But that is going to change because Azerbaijan is planning to start supplying them with Caspian gas. So the winner in that respect might be the trend in Europe to become independent from Russian energy and to develop more renewable energy sources. And we already have indications that this is happening, and it's being advanced in the last 1 year more than before. So if the climate gains from that, if the environment gains from that, it will be great, because the environment suffered tremendously from the war in Ukraine, and the emissions have increased immensely from the war actions. So it is the devastation that affects everyone, in my opinion.
Margarita, thank you. You're right in the sense that the war never brings in any winners or losers, right? It's never a winning situation. However, some countries do benefit more. So what is your opinion, Andrei?
No, we can talk in economic terms, in terms of, you've mentioned energy transition. It could speed up this energy transition, and Russia, in that sense, is also a loser. But you know, generally speaking, really, this is not. There are no signs of a new world order. We see only signs of a new world disorder, And we can say about one more end of history, for instance. No end of history again, and only history is present here. And but this is a way for maybe a new identity of the same Western world. What is Western world in new circumstances? We can hear voices in Europe that Europe finally is searching for its identity because it was relaxed during the period of the end of history, and now this is a good time to be more disciplined, to understand interests, to understand that there are shared values in Europe, and I think this is good. This is a good process. Euro-Atlantic kind of identical integration is on the rise in that sense. Ukraine, after the war, could experience big aspirations and great identical recovery, let's say. This is absolutely new nation, let's say, in that sense. Russia should be a big loser, again, in different terms, and it should be problematic to find a new place in this new order or disorder. But at the same time, this is not simply a case only for Russians. I understand that it's too early to talk about post-Putin future in Russia, but it will be a problem for Europe, for Western world as well, because again, Russia will not disappear.
Right. And Dr. Gabor, your view from Turkey, so what are your thoughts on the dynamics between Russia, Turkey, NATO, and the EU in the Black Sea? What is the future of the contested region?
Yes, I'm based in Odessa. I just have to say that I work for the Atlantic Council in Turkey, but I'm Ukrainian foreign policy analyst, and now I'm in Odessa. So my view will be from the Black Sea, but from this part of the Black Sea. Just a couple of words regarding the previous question on who will be the main beneficiary of this war. This is a history in the making, and we do not have a crystal ball to say who is going to win this war. But it's interesting when I talk to my Georgian colleagues and I ask what are your expectations and what the West can do to help you. And the answer that I generally get is the West has to make sure Ukraine wins this war, and Ukraine's victory will be also victory for Georgia, because the occupation of the territories of Ukraine will mean also the occupation of the territories of Georgia. And when I talk to my colleagues in Moldova and I ask, what are your expectations? They say the same. We want Ukraine liberated. We want Ukraine in its borders of 1991, including Crimea, which will not remain a stronghold for Russian military activities in the region. And we also want Ukraine joining NATO and the EU, because this means that Moldova and Georgia in the long run will also be able to join the EU and NATO. So I think this is kind of a use it or lose it moment to make sure that the international organizations reconsider their principles, starting from Russia still being a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, which is a nonsense, I'm sorry, with the president who had been issued an arrest warrant by the International Criminal Court, and this country still being in the United Nations Security Council, to the voting procedures in NATO and the EU, where there are now discussions about moving from the unanimity of votes to the majority. So in a way, this is up to us to decide who will become the winner in this war and in the future generally. Coming back to Turkey, NATO, and Russia and dynamics in the Black Sea region, I think it's quite clear that for Turkey, it's economic cooperation, it's energy cooperation, obviously, because Turkey gets more than 45% of it gets from Russia. And it's all these benefits that Turkey can get from playing a role of facilitator and mediator between Russia and Ukraine, which matter for Turkey in its relations with Russia. But when it comes to defense, when it comes to military cooperation, when it comes to the regional security, Turkey is a NATO member, and it has been very vocal about its intentions to remain a crucial and key NATO member. Turkey has closed the straits for the Russian warships. Turkey has been providing Ukraine with significant military assistance. So for Turkey, what is important is to remain a key player in the region, not to open the Black Sea region for the presence of the external actors, non-Black Sea regional, non-littoral states. But despite its cooperation with Russia, growing cooperation, despite opening its gates and borders for Russian tourists, Russian capital, Russian businesses, Turkey has been very clear about supporting territorial integrity for Ukraine, because increased Russian presence or Russia strengthening its military posture in the Black Sea is an obvious and clear threat to Turkey's national security. So here, economically and energy-wise, yes, there is this growing cooperation with Russia, but on the other hand, in terms of defense and regional security, Turkey is and will remain on the side of NATO and Ukraine and Georgia here in the region.
We are nearing the end of our discussion, so I would like to ask my last question, actually, to Professor Gadadze. Based on your experience as former Georgia State Minister for European and Euro-Atlantic integration, what changes have you seen in the UN, OSCE, and EU reactions since the Russian invasion to Georgia in 2008? Russia still occupies 20% of Georgian territory, right? And occupation of Donbass and Crimea in 2014, and now full-fledged war. So what lessons have these international organizations learned since Russia started the war in Ukraine?
Well, thank you for this question. Maybe in 1 minute to contribute to this discussion. Yeah, 1 minute to this discussion about the benefits. We already mentioned China, and China not only vis-a-vis its power balance with Russia, but China appears, compared to Russia, now much more a responsible world power, because China is not as openly in favor of war. China is balancing Russia's nuclear threats also, because China is against the use of nuclear weapons for many reasons that I have no time to develop. And so China appears as kind of winner economically, politically, and as a world, one of the world leaders. Turkey, it was brilliantly demonstrated by our colleague from Ukraine, including in the region, I mean, in the Caucasus, in South Caucasus, in the Balkans, in Northern Africa, where Russia and Turkey are competing, in Libya or in Syria also. So Turkey will also take some benefits from this confrontation and future outcome of the war. And if we want the West also to take benefits, we have to, and it joins the question you asked about the lessons learned. The West can take benefits or can be winner from this conflict only if the West takes lessons from what's happened from 2008 to 2024, 23. So what was the West's attitude before? It was appeasement, appeasement, appeasement. The war, when the war started in Georgia, first the West, when Georgia was warning the West about the possibility of the war, the answer was no, 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 it will not happen, and we're against the war. And this was very general discussions about how bad is the war. And West had no idea what was Russian tactics about this hybrid. Even the concept of hybrid war didn't exist in 2008, in 2009. So what happened in Georgia in 2008 was considered as kind of, at the end, okay, there were provocations from Georgia's side, and Georgians overreacted, and then Russians overreacted. So the whole dynamics, what happened before 2008, the fact that Russians had proxies and they were heavily involved in these conflicts on Georgian territory, was not analyzed, was not taken as a lesson. So after 2008, there were other mistakes, like the famous reset policy. 2014, it was a wake-up call. Of course, Russia occupies and annexes Crimea. Wake-up call. We start sanctions, etc. But very quickly, Nord Stream 2. Again, huge mistake. So now the third wave of this conflict, where the things are now look like quite different. The Western reaction is much sharper. We have never witnessed such level of sanctions against Russia and retaliatory measures and military aid to Ukraine. But as Winston Churchill once said, we can trust the Americans to do the right thing, but only once they have exhausted all the other solutions, alternative solutions. So this time has come now. But again, I'm still a little bit afraid of some discussions I witness in the West, in Europe, but also in the US. Again, fearing, well, what will happen if Russia is too weak? We should not humiliate Russia. Remember this famous phrase of one of the European leaders. So this shows that there's still not at the end a total clear understanding what can happen after this war. Even if Russia is defeated and everyone is in the West, there's a consensus about that Russia should be defeated, but then the attitudes. So this appeasement policy should be banned forever. This fear of escalation. You know, if Ukraine got the weapons they got now after the war, this war would not happen. Maybe, you know, would not have happened. We remember that the West was refusing even defensive weapons to Ukraine. Ukrainians were begging for javelins and this kind of stuff. Now they had much more, but before the war, there was no consensus about helping even with the defensive weapons to Ukraine. So this kind of mentality should change in the West if we want to avoid this kind of, and the understanding of what is Russia in this current imperial shape. You know, I will finish, maybe I'm too long, but with two quotations. One from Lenin. You know, Lenin in 1917, I think he wrote that the ultimate phase of imperialism is war. So if Russia stays an empire, even defeated, but still an empire, the war and other wars will not be avoidable. If Putin remains in power with some defeat, but still remains in power, there will be other wars. Because we see, since Putin is president of Russia, the succession of wars. It started in Chechnya, Second Chechen War, then Georgia, then Ukraine, then Syria, then Ukraine again. So this regime is, the very deep nature of this regime is to wage wars, to survive and to assert its own power inside the country. And the last point and the last quotation is very old, and for me one of the best observers of Russia in history. It's the French Marquis Astolphe de Custine, who analyzed the nature of the Russian regime, the fact that Russian population under the tyranny so much humiliated and smashed that they consider that humiliation they can inflict to the other countries as kind of compensation. So without democratization of Russia, we can still fear another conflict coming, because the tyrannic regimes or dictatorial regimes, Putin or someone else, will always project its power on outside to compensate the suffering they are giving to the Russian population. And this is very dangerous, and the West should understand that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We could go on and on. We have very knowledgeable panelists, but let's open the floor for our audience. Any questions, please? So please help me select and give the microphone.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. David Matsaberdze from Philly State University. I will have a question to Dr. Kolesnikov. In 2015 or 2016, you wrote for Carnegie Europe regarding the prospects of developments in Russia. The title was like, by means of bread alone, why poor Russians were not protesting. And how do you see that prospect? Because those poor Russians now are sent to Ukraine and are back as Gruzdosti. So what is the nature of protest, could be the nature of protest in the case of, let's say, of the defeat in Ukraine? Thank you.
Despite the fact that we can't see any kind of visible protests in Russia right now, we must understand that the level of suppression is very high and it's impossible to go to the streets at all. But resistance is still here. We can indicate what kind of social layer or social group is protesting, because we simply see individual protests, individual resistance. If we'll open the website OVD-Info, you could see the statistics of this resistance. Around 20,000 detained people for anti-war words or activity, more than 6,000 administrative cases against people who express anti-war views, more than 500 criminal cases against people who express their views anti-war and anti-war activity. In that sense, we see kind of a new forms of protests, like individual resistance to the regime. Yes, there are a lot of people who are still mute, but who are against this war against Putin and were always against Putin, against all his initiatives. We can talk about 15 or 20% of the population. Generally, it means that millions of people are against this war. But their main enemy is indifference of imaginary man in the middle, who is following simply the mainstream. If Putin tomorrow will come to the tribune and he could say, okay, I was mistaken, let's return to democracy, this man in the middle could say, okay, if he says like this, we'll follow new rules, it's okay, the war was bad, and let's begin from the scratch. This is the behavior of the majority of the population. When we're talking about people who are supporting war, we must understand that the biggest bunch of people, they don't have their own opinion about anything. They follow television, they follow Putin's words, they follow official discourse, not more. What about social protests? Again, the level of suppression does not allow people, as enterprises, to be so active in that sense. Not to mention that, yes, in these circumstances, the adaptation is the main way of behavior for the majority of Russians.
Thank you. Shalwa, please, your question.
Thank you very much. I have a pretty much military question to Dr. Gabar. What if the major Ukrainian military counteroffensive fails? And what would be the reaction of first the Ukrainian society? What do you think? And the reaction of the West, since the West is the major military supplier to the Ukrainian army? This is the first question. And second, given this terrorist act on Kakhovka Dam, which is obviously was done by the Russian forces, and there is no doubt about it, the question of the possible use of the tactical nuclear weapons, if the Russians see that the major military counteroffensive will go even beyond the objectives it could reach, and if they see that that this offensive would end up in a strategic defeat of the Russian forces, leading to the total deoccupation of Ukraine in a manner of, I don't know, with just 1 month in the period. So what your expectation about the use of tactical nukes from Russia, and is the Crimea the so-called red line, which would then prompt the Russians to actually resort to this ultima ratio? Thank you.
Start with first question on possible failure for Ukraine.
Yeah, thank you, Shalvar, for great questions. Regarding the counteroffensive, for Ukrainians, it's obvious that we will carry on as long as it's necessary. That's why I mentioned that this may be one counteroffensive, but there are no expectations there will be a short breakthrough like in Kharkiv, like in Kherson, because now we're talking about a front line which is a couple of 1,000 kilometers long. And now we're talking about the Russian side, which has been preparing for this counteroffensive. So they have all these engineering lines of protection, several lines actually of defense. That's why it will not be an easy walk. And there is no this naive expectation in Ukraine that we will have a 3-day blitzkrieg and then take over Crimea, Donetsk, Lugansk, and all other regions. But on the other hand, in Ukraine, we have these social polls regularly. So just recently, yesterday or the other day, we had a new poll coming saying that 95% of Ukrainians believe in their victory, meaning liberation of territories as of 1991. More than 60% understand that this will not be an easy task and that the war may go on for more than a year, but they are ready to fight and they are ready to resist as long as it takes. So in a way, from the Ukrainian perspective, it's easy to give answer to that question because we have no other option. And it's easy to make decisions when you don't have too many options. You will either fight for survival, because this is not a war of choice for Ukraine, this is a war for survival, or we will be killed by shelling, or we will be killed in the occupied territories. I'm sorry for my voice. But anyways, there will be no disappointment and giving up from the Ukrainian side. Regarding the US reaction and the Western reaction generally, I think that there is a concern, which is generally shared, that in case we cannot liberate our territories now, and we fail to show some important successes on the battlefield, there will be more and more pressure to getting back to the negotiations table, to freezing the situation as we have, to having this ceasefire, meaning that 20% of Ukraine will remain under occupation. That's why there is no rush for this counteroffensive. There is, on the one hand, very good and solid preparation, including equipment and arms supplies from the West, including training for our armed forces and regrouping. And on the other hand, there is now a big change in rhetoric of the Ukrainian government, saying that even if this is not one counteroffensive, but a series of counteroffensives, it's not only about Ukrainian security, but European security to bring this war to an end with Ukraine's victory. Regarding the Kakhovka Dam, and obviously there is a lot of disinformation and misinformation of alleged shelling from Ukrainian side. I just want to underline that all technicalities and all experts in the field say that there is no way this dam could have been damaged by any HIMARS system, any other system from outside. The level of damage and the destruction there showed that it's an explosion of the explosive material that had been laid there from inside, because otherwise it's not possible. Such facility, they are made in a way that they would survive kind of a nuclear war. So you cannot just shell it like a bridge or any other construction and then it falls apart. So obviously this has been done before, that has been prepared, and that has been done to stop Ukrainian counteroffensive. Whether this means that the use of nukes is becoming more likely, I would say yes, but a lot depends on the reaction from the West. If we have the same reaction from the international community as we've had so far, it's not so clear what happened. We have to look into it more precisely. And then the United Nations celebrating the day of the Russian language, whereas thousands of people have been drowning and displaced from the territories which remained under the water, then of course such a weak reaction, it increases the possibility and the likelihood of the use of any weapons of mass destruction. If we have a more solid and stronger reaction from our partners and from the world generally, I think that all these red lines, including Crimea, including all others, they are quite flexible, and they have been quite flexible. We saw that with Moscow warship, we saw that with Ukraine getting candidate status in the EU, Finland becoming member of NATO, drones landing in Russia, and all these cross-border operations. The red lines are there as long as they are allowed to be drawn by international community. If we do not buy Russian saber rattling and Russian blackmail, and then those red lines turn into rose lines, into white lines until they disappear, because this is how generally this rhetoric works. But again, what we are witnessing so far, Russia has been shelling, for example, ammonium pipelines in the Kharkiv region of Ukraine, which is another kind of a biological weapons, because this is about chemicals, about ammonium. The same we see with the Kakhovka Dam, so on and so forth. So the escalation is there. The likelihood of the use of nukes, I would say, is increasing, but it's not very high now. But a lot depends on how we push back and how we react to what we have now.
We have time for one more question from the audience, please.
Thank you. David Darciashvili from Ilia State University. I have a question to Andrei also, because I think the internal affairs in Russia is a very important variable in all future developments. So you said that Russia is a modern society and it has something to do with the continuation of war. We know history is a bad teacher, but still we apply to history. So Russia lost at least 4 wars in modern times, from Crimean War to withdrawal from Afghanistan. So what is your expectation? How long Russian society can endure this contest of will and nerves, which any war is? So when we may expect, if you agree that we may expect, the collapse of Russian will to continue this war?
Do you have a crystal ball?
I think the only crystal ball we have, this is the brains of Putin and his desire to continue. The problem is that this regime is strongly personalized, and again, the main supporter of this war in Russian society is this very indifference and readiness to follow any rules which are coming from the top. I think we can't wait for any end point of this story until the moment when Putin will go away in any possible way. Yes, and I'm more optimistic than some other experts in our domestic community when we're talking about Putinism, which could survive Putin, for instance, in the circumstances of the post-Putin Russia. And in this sense, we have really only one teacher as a history. We can remember that after the death of Stalin, even his hangman, overnight they began to liberalize the country to some extent. The same story with these people from Brezhnev gerontocratia circles. After that, again, overnight, Gorbachev began the process of liberalization. But all these impulses were coming from the top. Yes, the society was ready to accept changes, to accept even liberalization, modernization, normalization of the Soviet Union and then of Russia, but the first impulse must come from the elites. These elites are maybe cracked right now, but we can see these cracks only in their brains. They are afraid of being open in that sense. They're afraid of being active. They can't initiate any kind of conspiracy against Putin because they don't have common ground. They're very disrupted. So in that sense, we must have this very strategic patience waiting for the future, Alice.
Thank you. So, and to be fair to all panelists, let's close this discussion with 1 minute final statement from each panelist, because we did cover a lot of issues actually. So, Dr. Gertadze, please.
Is there any topic or just?
Be with the focus on your recommendations for the strategy that benefits the region and the people, both politically and economically.
Oh, so I will not go for recommendations. It would be too pretentious. But my hope is that this war that Russia started more than a year ago, as I said in my last answers to your questions, will really change the attitude in the Western community of states. Because so far what was prevalent was the contrary, was not even understanding the idea of what would be what would be good for internal, security for this region regarding Russia. Now there's no excuse, and I hope very much that once the conflict will end, the Americans will not retreat and will not go back to this tendency, long tendency of becoming less interested in European affairs and Middle Eastern affairs, etc. and that the price that Ukrainians have paid and they continue to pay with their blood will serve at least the Western capitals to profoundly reassess and reshape their attitude regarding the security architecture in the region.
Senema, please, your thoughts. 1 minute.
I think that as a result of the war in Ukraine, as a consequence, I would say, we see a consolidated West, both the European Union and NATO. Within these organizations and between them, there is a lot more exchange and cooperation. Consolidated West we have not seen for a long time. It's been New Europe, Old Europe, and all that. Divisions of the new members who are weaker, who are economically underdeveloped. Now the situation is changing. We're going to see a changed Europe, and the leaders of Europe are going to be closer to our region here. Those future leaders of Europe are going to be the countries in Eastern Europe. And I think the second thing that happened, we see finally much more truthful, much more close to the truth understanding of Russia, and that view prevails regardless of some other, regardless of individual voices here and there. We see increased NATO capabilities and mobilization of all assets to develop a strong military defense of European continent. And what we need to see here is a look to the future, imagining the outcome for the region, the geopolitical developments and the individual developments within Russia, and preparing for them, because we should not be taken by surprise again.
Margarita. Andrei, please.
I think that's the only way, the only possible recommendation in these circumstances could be the involvement of the new generation of Russians into the Western world. And the only tool for that is education.
Brief and up to the point. Now, Dr. Gaber, your final thoughts.
Yeah, I think it's important to keep in mind that this is a system-changing, transformative war. So whatever happens in Ukraine does not stay in Ukraine, and the implications of any end state in Ukraine will be also felt throughout the region, in Georgia, in Moldova, and generally in Europe. So when we make our choices and take our decisions on how to proceed with supporting or not supporting Ukraine, we have to keep in mind that either we have the occupation of all occupied territories in the region in different countries and rules-based world order, or we have failed Western democratic institutions and liberal world order, and then the right of the might rather than the might of the right. That's why it's up to us to decide on which side of history we are.
So thank you very much, all. We are out of time now. Appreciation for your attention, for your excellent questions, and special thanks again to the University of Georgia Security Platform who made this event possible. I hope this panel discussion helped better understand the options of military outcome and respective political-economic consequences of the Russian war in Ukraine. In particular, that Ukraine will never be Russia. Ukraine, as our panelists said, stands strong, sovereign, independent, firmly in control of its own destiny. And in this, Putin's primary goal, he has already failed. On behalf of the U.S. Agency for Global Media, I want to assure you that the Voice of America and Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe will continue bringing you credible and uncensored information about the war. Thank you.
To all panelists, to panel moderator for excellent moderation. Just one administrative remark. We have 10 minutes for a coffee break, and then I ask you to remain so energetically as you are and proceed to your respective working groups. We're waiting for you there as well. Thank you again. Now we have a coffee break.